Our topic today is aligning and energizing your senior leadership team. And as I said, my name is Izzy Martins, and I am the Senior Manager of Client Experience at the Nebo Company. The Nebo Company is a leadership development firm located in Washington, D.C., and we work at the intersection of strategy, development, leadership, and culture, providing facilitations, trainings, retreats, and executive coaching to leaders. Today, we're delighted to share insights from almost 15 years of work with leaders. Before we begin, I want to give you a few basic instructions for how to interact with the webinar today. So you have 3 ways to participate in today's webinar. The first way is to participate in the poll that we'll share in just a few minutes. At one point, we'll ask you a question and a poll will pop up on your computer screen. We would love you to vote in that poll, and we'll alert you when it's time to do so. The second way is to type in your questions. So in your computer screen, you should see that you have 2 options. You have a question and answer function in the Zoom window, and there's also a comment function. If at any time you have a question, feel free to type it in using either that Q&A button or the chat function, and we'll make sure to address your question. The next thing is just some general troubleshooting. If you have any problems at any time during the webinar, you can send me a private chat message or send me an email. My email address is imartins@nebocompany.com. So with that, I am now pleased to introduce our facilitator today, Kate Ebner. Kate Ebner is the CEO and founder of the Nebo Company and founding director of Georgetown University's Institute for Transformational Leadership. Kate has served as Chief People Officer at Kaiser Associates, an international strategy consulting firm. And as a coach and facilitator, Kate works with leaders who want to deliver on their mission and vision to achieve transformational outcomes. Kate, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Izzy, and welcome everyone. As I've thought about this topic today, I've realized that this is a big topic. So we're going to try to cover a lot of ground in the time we have and also leave some time for questions at the end. I'll jump right in and tell you that the reason we selected this topic of aligning and energizing your senior leadership team is because this has proven to be the topic that the CEOs whom I coach tell me is the topic that keeps them up at night. And so frequently in our work as leadership coaches working one-on-one or working with executive teams or senior leadership teams, we see the same kinds of challenges and problems all over in across industries, different kinds of organizations. The need for a strong leadership team is incredibly important, and yet it's actually hard to get the kind of high-performing teamwork that we're looking for. So, we ask ourselves, what makes it so challenging to hire, develop, and align a group of willing executives? And I like that word willing. Everyone's intention is to do a great job, to show up, to do something challenging and important, and to do it well together. And yet, why does it not always work? You wonder, what can a cohesive, well-functioning leadership team accomplish? What if it did work? And I think very often people have not had enough experiences of really great executive leadership teamwork to know the difference. And I think if you ever have had that experience, you tend to be able to work toward it more effectively with more clarity about what you're doing. And then I think this hard question here, what can be done to address negative patterns and attitudes? And quite often when we get the phone call inviting the Nebo Company to come and do some team coaching, we're stepping into a room where people have developed patterns and behaviors, ways of working together, whether it's working well or not. One of the most important things that we do when we first step in is to observe and to really learn what are the patterns at play here, what's working and what isn't. So those are some of the things that we think need to be addressed just in order to begin the reflective process of identifying what your team needs. And this is a great question just floating up from the bottom here. What must leaders grasp about being part of the senior most team in the organization? This is something we're going to talk about today in this time we have. You know, one of the things I was recently talking with someone about is that we're often promoted up into these senior level roles without a whole lot of conversation and discussion about what it means to be in the senior most role or on the senior most team. So we're going to tackle some of these questions, and I think we're going to share 5 strategies today. We're also going to give you some information that we think will be helpful to you as a reference point after the webinar. Katzenbach and Smith famously define a team as a small number of people with complementary skills who are committed to a common purpose, set of performance goals, and approach for which they hold themselves mutually accountable. And you may have heard me in the past say that this is one of my favorite definitions because it seems to me that probably a group of people sat in a room for 2 weeks to come out with such a complete definition of what a team is. We also know that the best, highest functioning teams are often 7 people, plus or minus 2, right? So when we say a small number of people, we really mean under 10, with complementary skills, people each bringing their own strengths. Those could be skills and knowledge. They could also be styles and leadership styles and methods of participating. We're committed to a common purpose, and we're going to spend some time on that today. Set of performance goals and approach. And I think very often the work that NEBO does is to really shine a light with teams on what is our purpose, what are our important goals, and what is the approach to which we'll hold ourselves accountable. So some common maladies of senior leadership teams. Now this page we're looking at was extremely easy to create, just sitting down and thinking through what are the things that come up all the time everywhere. And I'd say the first one at the top is siloed thinking and participation. People really sitting down at that leadership table, but bringing a functional perspective versus a firm-wide perspective, thinking about what's critical for them, their area, their teams, their stakeholders, instead of the organization more broadly. Overcompensating for the leader's style. Sometimes the leader's style is very reserved, and others fill in and step up and speak over and explain what the leader wants. Sometimes the leader's style is dominating and very much front and center, in which case often teams get quiet and people overcompensate for that style by building alliances around the room. It's really interesting as leaders to stop and think about how our styles help our teams and where our styles become kind of a default to which the people at our tables are trying to manage. A lack of focus on critical outcomes. We sit down to meet. What are we meeting about? And what does this have to do with our end goals and our most important priorities? That's a question that seems obvious, but if you actually ask people and interview them at a leadership team meeting, quite often you'll hear very different responses about what the focus should be and what the critical outcomes really are. Competition and reactivity between senior leadership team members. When there's a dynamic that does not work well for constructive debate and conversation, you'll often see people competing not only for a predominant point of view, in other words, to win the conversation, but also to ally themselves with people who they perceive to be decision makers and the power people in the room. Sometimes those dynamics really interfere with effective teamwork. No clear unifying vision. That is one that we see all the time, and often teams will understand sort of like what are our goals as a business or as an organization, but they'll forget to actually articulate and then use a really clear vision of where we're going. And then the last one is poor meeting discipline. And this phrase, meeting discipline, is one that I find myself saying a lot lately. What is meeting discipline? And meeting discipline is showing up how to facilitate or run a meeting where we have adequate time, attention, and facilitation around the key topics at the table. So we often show up ready to participate without having done our pre-work, without having paying attention to time, without paying attention to how we're actually moving from topic to resolution. And so this is in and of itself probably a whole series of trainings. The question that we have for you is, which of these senior leadership team maladies do you see most often in your organization? I'll put them back on the screen. And Izzy, would you like to remind people of how to participate in the poll?
Sure. So right now I'm going to launch a poll, and you'll see that you have a few choices here. So we've asked you the question, which of these common team maladies do you see most often? So take a moment and think through these options. You'll see them all up in front of you. And just take the next 45 seconds or so and cast a vote. Is it siloed thinking? Is it compensating for the leader's style, lack of focus, competition, no clear vision, poor meeting discipline, or maybe there's an other option that you'd like to comment on? So I'll give you just about 10 more seconds here. Please vote if you haven't already. And then we'll take a look at the results. So take the time to cast your final vote, and we'll see what we got. So you should see the poll results up on the screen, and it looks like no clear unifying vision is coming out as the #1 team malady that we see. A close second is siloed thinking and participation. And then under that, we have competition and reactivity between team members. Kate, any thoughts on this?
I'm not surprised, actually. I guess that's my thought. The no clear unifying vision is an important one because it's often something that the leader of the team isn't thinking about. So busy trying to get results and get movement on key issues that we forget to articulate and bring people together around that that future focus, that what does success look like question. So I'm not surprised to see that one. The siloed thinking and participation has turned out to be probably one of the greatest impediments to functioning well as an executive team. People don't necessarily realize that this team isn't the same as every other team they're on. This is a team that's for the organization and needs to think as an organization across these silos. So that is, I'm not surprised to see either of those two, but I would also say this poll alone maybe gives people a sense that they're not alone in these challenges and maybe where to start as you think about working with your leadership team. Thank you, Izzy.
Great, thank you.
I'm going to move us out of that. So what is the effect of a low performing leadership team? And I think probably as I ask this question, you're imagining a team you've been on where you've already experienced this. So this is something we all know. It's interesting to know that 97% of executives believe that increased effectiveness of the senior leadership team would have a positive impact on their organizations. So we sort of believe in this idea of an effective senior leadership team is really vital to the future and to the well-being of our organizations. But only 18% of the organizations say their leaders are very effective at meeting business goals. And only 18% of CEOs rate their executive team as very effective. So this is this is troubling, right? We know how important this is, and yet we look around and we fewer than 20% of organizations and CEOs surveyed feel that they're actually getting that effectiveness out of this team. This is a huge opportunity. The effect of a low-performing team, first and foremost, is a loss of trust, not only on the team, but often throughout the organization. The second one is poor communication and transparency of decision-making. In other words, if a team's not performing well, you don't hear the same consistent messages. You don't have a sense of here's where we're going, here's where we've been. Confusion can result about priorities and direction. Dynamics at the senior leadership team level get played out throughout the organization. And finally, we just don't achieve results or earn the reputation that we are striving so hard to do. There's a real impact when it comes to supporting and developing executive teams. A classic case study, and as I was thinking about the many teams that I work with and have worked with and have been on, and a typical team, maybe this is a good example, is, let's just say an 8-member senior leadership team, although I have sat in rooms with senior leadership teams as large as 14 or 18, meets weekly for 2 hours, a long meeting weekly. CEO has a strong action-oriented style and grows impatient with group discussion, often as the default decision maker. Maybe you've been in the room with that leader. Intense dynamics and history among team members that inhibit robust discussion of issues and goals. Very often, this is where team coaching is valuable, helping to sort of reset the dial, if you will, on some of these dynamics. Discussions that devolve from the agenda item and run past the allotted time. This is back to that topic of meeting disciplines. Meetings occurring outside the meeting. So we had our meeting, but now we're meeting in each other's offices to talk about the meeting we just had and what we're really going to do. You might be familiar with that. Meeting minutes are detailed and capture the agreed upon actions, but people rarely refer back to them. So we went to the trouble of taking copious notes and capturing minutes, but we don't actually use them as a point of reference for accountability and progress note-taking. And then most meeting agendas focus on the urgent and important, i.e. the board meeting that's coming or the quarterly result, whatever it is, versus more strategic, perhaps longer term topics. So I don't know, I mean, it's interesting to lay this out. When I think about this case study, I think about, okay, many things are actually functioning. The team meets, they know who each other are, they have an agenda, they're taking minutes, they're focusing on important things, but are they getting from their meetings and from their conversations what they really need to run and lead the organization? My guess is that there's a lot of work that can be done here, and we'll talk about those strategies. So we've identified 5 strategies, and I think probably the more we prepared for this webinar, the more strategies we started to see. But the first one is to really articulate a compelling vision and strategy. By this, we mean not only for the organization, but we actually mean also for the senior leadership team. A clear team purpose, an executive mindset, and that's really about taking an enterprise view versus a siloed view or a functional view, prioritizing relationships among team members, and using meeting disciplines for accountability, alignment, and support. So the first strategy is about vision. And through vision, leaders can unify the organization, help everybody shift from just reacting to what's happening to being more future focused, more strategic, and more planful. This is a really important shift, and one that the CEO is responsible to lead with the support and engagement of the senior leadership team. Through vision, leaders can inspire commitment and performance from others and can create momentum and accountability for the future. When you articulate a vision, we can ask ourselves, how close are we? Are we almost there yet? Have we made progress? We can see what to celebrate and also what we need to double down on in order to achieve the goals that we have. Visionary leadership inspires through authentic, forward-looking communication. And so a visionary leader, and that could be any member of the senior leadership team, articulates, where are we going? And when we do visioning work, we usually look out 3 years, but there are good reasons to look out 1 year or 6 months. Where are we going? Can we describe that? For the sake of what are we doing? And that's mission. By when will we get there, and how? And that's strategy. So, you know, as we look at this, these ideas, I want to really focus us on the idea of a visionary leader articulates. So as senior leadership team members, how often are you talking about the future? How often are you describing by when will we get there? What will it look like? And how? Leaders who are talking about that are taking their organizations forward. Senior leadership teams also not only establish priorities and direction, but they also create the conditions at work. This is something that we don't always pay attention to, but the very culture of the organization is affected by the functioning or ill functioning of the senior leadership team. So we know that the senior leadership team set and communicate direction. They develop the strategy. They translate that into aligned action to achieve important goals throughout the organization, and ultimately goals that roll back up into achievement of the vision. They also create culture. If you're a senior leader, your style, your way of operating creates the conditions. Your way of working together creates the norms. Hiring, developing, and retaining the people who lead the results. So I guess when we think about our senior leaders, not only are they in a room together making strategic decisions and talking about important future focused things, they're also leaving that room and then creating the culture and the experience of the people that they hire. And this is vitally important to our ability to succeed as organizations. Again, underscoring how important it is to pay attention to the caliber and quality of how your senior leadership team is working.
And Kate, we had just one quick question on visioning. Why do we focus on 3 years?
You know, that's a great question. And what I've learned about visioning is that, first of all, the world is moving very, very rapidly. And occasionally we do vision work with institutions that take a much longer term view, for example, a city or a university. But for the most part, our organizations need to be adaptive to change, and that change is happening rapidly year by year. We sometimes will do a 5-year vision, but increasingly we're seeing that what's called medium-term planning is far more effective and creates a more adaptive and resilient company or organization and ability to navigate in that short term. Sometimes we'll do a longer term vision, say 5 to 7 years, but a shorter term strategic plan, say 1 to 3 years. So I think the day of the 5-year plan seems to have become the day of the 3-year plan. And I think that's really about focus, actually, for the organization and for the leadership group. Thanks for the question. So senior leadership teams must pay attention not only to getting things done, but also how they do so. And, you know, at Georgetown, at the Institute for Transformational Leadership, we've really come to appreciate that leaders who are leading change must really pay attention to these 4 things. So what can we see? And if you think about your senior leadership team, your ability to be strategic and visionary will very much be influenced by the leader's ability to see what's currently happening, to see the future that we're driving toward, and also to see the implications of history. So seeing, what we see is what we talk about, right? And so your team's ability to talk about the important, potentially controversial and difficult things will determine their effectiveness. And if we're afraid or don't have the right setup to have some of those challenging conversations, provocative, thoughtful conversations, then we often we might be seeing, but we're not saying all of what we need to say. And again, think about that team leaving that conference room, going back out into the organization. What are you talking about? How are you communicating the message? How are you sharing the communication of a common message? Now we finally get to doing, which is what senior leadership team members often believe their jobs to be, is to get things done. And that is indeed important and often the way we see and measure results. But I want to emphasize the final thing as well, which is being. And the question we often ask leaders when working with leadership presence is, what is it like to be with you? And sometimes that's an uncomfortable question, but if we were sitting in your senior leadership team meeting, what would the experience be like? What would we see happening? What are the dynamics? How are you contributing to those dynamics? Are you constructive? Are you destructive? Are you impatient? Are you thoughtful? Are you creative? How do you innovate together? You know, what's the presence that you individually bring and that you bring as a team? These, again, are the things that influence culture. So some questions for the senior leadership team. I'm not going to spend time on these, but I wanted to give you these coaching questions because I think these are good takeaways for senior leadership teams to actually just sit down and say, if we had to articulate our vision, particularly our organizational vision, not just the impact we have in the marketplace or on our constituent groups, but actually our vision of this organization, let's just say 3 years down the road, can we do it? And if not, let's do it. Can you describe how the function or area you oversee, your own purview, contributes to the achievement of that vision? This is critically important if you're going to go back and lead an aligned achievement of that vision. And then finally, what kind of leadership is needed from you at this time in this organization? And what kind of leadership is needed from the senior leadership team to get there? So we think about this, like this question of what kind of leadership is needed. And if you've been at your organization a long time, you may have gotten comfortable or gotten used to bringing a certain approach when actually the conditions around you and around the organization have changed and evolved. It might be time to do something different in terms of the way you approach how you lead. The second one I want to point to is purpose. What is the purpose of a senior leadership team? And there are 2 critical roles that they play, and we've touched on them already. This is a definition from the Center for Creative Leadership. First and foremost, they provide strategic and operational leadership to the organization. And secondly, they provide that organizational and cultural DNA. and how well they function makes a difference. So does your team have a clear team purpose? Again, if we interviewed everybody on your senior leadership team, could people describe what that team purpose is? Here are 4 different teams describing why they exist. I kind of like the second one here. We set direction, grapple with tough questions, and make sure everyone is rowing in the same direction. But you'll notice these concepts, like we're accountable for the future. We have to be in sync. We provide strategic direction and leadership, but we've also got to align. That's consistent across. These were all teams that did a lot of work to be as effective as they became. So ask yourselves, as a senior leadership team, who are we to others and who do they need us to be? What do we need to do to become the leadership team that this organization needs at this time? We like to give you questions, being coaches. So again, here's a little tool that you could actually bring back to a leadership team to talk about how you are working together and to identify areas where you might be able to improve. And I think one of the values of a set of questions is it doesn't presume that there's one right answer. It actually opens up the conversation. The third strategy is executive mindset versus solo, contributor mindset. So making sure that you're taking an enterprise view. So we think about the question of what does it mean to be more executive? And I think rather than a poll, we'll just do a little bit of chat here. What do you think it means to be more executive? And as I'm talking, would love for you to chat your own answers to us about this question. I will tell you that, and I'll add this here, that the most common need expressed in 360s and stakeholder feedback for executive leaders whom we speak, where we're doing the work of developing those leaders and we're reaching out to get stakeholder feedback, we often hear the advice, he or she needs to be more executive. And so this idea of more executive has become interesting and important to us. We've learned that when we probe this a bit, usually the person who's speaking thinks that it means acting for the good of the entire organization rather than focusing on the interests of your own team, your own function, or your own constituency. Did anybody offer us anything here? We have a couple of ideas coming in.
Yes, we do. So someone said care about their people more than themselves.
Very nice definition. Yeah, putting others first. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Another response is to be visionary and not worry about the day-to-day issue because those are or should be delegated to others.
Yes, I like that too. And what I do notice these days is that a lot of times we actually have to do more of the day-to-day than we'd like as executive leaders. I've been thinking of it almost like hovercraft. You have to be able to fly up and really be that visionary strategic thinker, but sometimes you actually have to hover down closer to the ground and also have a insight and knowledge of what's happening across the organization or in key areas. So I'm glad you pointed that out. And in an ideal world, that's actually what we'd see. I'd say some versatility is also useful there. What else?
Yep. We have someone saying being strategic, forward-looking, present, and inspiring confidence.
Nice.
And after that, we have focusing on strategy, the big picture, the long term.
Good.
Modeling the behaviors you want to see in your organization.
Great. Thank you. That's a culture impact right there. Take a couple more, Izzy.
A few more, sure. Let's see. Communicate to their teams the team's role in execution.
Very good. Very important.
We have taking ownership of vision and taking responsibility on behalf of the employees and the organization. And we have the responses are rolling in now to be connected, compelling, and courageous.
Fantastic.
We have someone who can zoom in and zoom out, handle uncertainty, create direction and ambiguity. And then our final one is make development of people and giving them opportunities to make a difference in the business. And then one more popped up, to live out the organization's culture.
Wow. I would love it if we all could be a team. This is great.
It is.
You know, one thing that stands out to me about all of this is so many of these things point to this idea of seeing. What can you see? Can you see the big picture? Can you also see the criticalities at the ground level, right? What can you say? How do you communicate? How do you help people make the connections needed? What do you do? How do you drive accountability results? How do you make sure that when you walk into the room, people are getting what they need from you toward achieving? And then finally, being. What's the presence you're bringing? And some of you really brought some great distinctions around presence. I would just simply add the word systems thinking. Can you see the whole system, meaning the whole organization? And that goes back to the idea of keeping your head at a higher level, at a bigger picture, not just about what's happening externally, but also internally. So thank you. These are terrific. I'm going to keep going. And, you know, I want to bring Peter Drucker into this. He has a great quote here about this idea of executive mindset. Leaders who work most effectively never say I, and that's not because they've trained themselves not to say I. They do not think I. They think we. They think team. They understand their job to be to make the team function. They accept responsibility and do not sidestep it, but we gets the credit. And I think that this is something that once you've been doing it a while, you probably don't even think about it anymore. But people who are moving up and into these senior executive roles have to make that shift from thinking about what am I responsible for to the we that is the senior leadership team. This is a conversation that we wish senior leadership teams were having. Here's a little bit more Peter Drucker. He says, what makes an effective executive? He says, they asked what needs to be done. They asked what's right for the enterprise. They developed action plans. They took responsibility for decisions. They took responsibility for communicating. They focused on opportunities rather than problems. That's a framing choice. They ran productive meetings. They thought and said we rather than I. I like that a lot. And I think if we took that out to senior leadership teams and said, how do you think you're doing at these things? You'd probably be able to, once again, zero in on something to work on. The fourth strategy is actually the strategy of prioritizing relationships. And we know that teams develop in a consistent way. And here are a few examples of models that we use when we're working with teams and that you probably are familiar with. But the one I want to focus on, I just want to focus on Tuckman for a moment and Lencioni. Right? Tuckman helped us understand that teams move through predictable stages of development. They begin with forming, they move to storming, norming, performing, and then my friend Alexander Caillet added dorming, which is sort of like a plateau, and then death or revitalization. What's interesting about this wheel here is that teams can form, and then as a new member joins or someone leaves, the team is ready to just sort of paddle on as if not much has changed, you know, just welcome to the new person. But actually the team must and will, whether it realizes it or not, reform, restorm, and renorm in order to perform. Despite how predictable these stages of team development are, there's relatively little attention given to executive peer transitions and team building at the senior leadership level. And people come and go, right? So when we look at this, it's interesting to also notice that it's not always a flow in one direction. Like you could form and storm and norm and perform, and then find yourself storming again and have to work on norming and performing, right? So the work of being on a well-functioning team is not unlike perhaps the work of a marriage or the work of a family, where you get through something, you get good at something, and before you know it, there's something else for you to be working on and learning. Teams that are functioning well attend to 5 commitments, and we often refer to the work of Patrick Lencioni, our work at NEBO. You'll notice that results are only one element of a high and well-functioning team. So we think about teams are responsible for results, but look, 4 out of the 5 categories here, trust, conflict, commitment, and accountability, are related to the quality of relationships. Trust is the foundation of strong teams, and it's you really can't get to the same level of performance and results without that trust being in place. That's always the starting point when a team wants to get better. So how do you play? We teach at NEBO in our one-on-one coaching a simple framework that I probably created long ago. And that the framework is 4 words: kind, clear, fair, and firm, right? If team members aspire as leaders to these 4 adjectives, they'll find that they're bringing a style, a presence, a way of operating that engenders respect, sets the conditions for trust, and actually leads to a sort of transparency and commitment. So kind is you can do hard things and still be kind. Clear is say what you mean and be clear what's on the table, what the issues are. Fair is be open-minded and consider other points of view, or even rethinking your own point of view as you get more informed by others. And firm is when a decision's made, the decision's made, right? Not being wishy-washy or having that meeting outside the meeting. These simple words are just, they're here in this deck primarily because this is a strategy for an individual leader that if it were writ large across a team would make a big difference in team dynamics. One team we've been working with shared their insights about lessons from past experiences and specifically about what they learned from other teams. And this particular team was struggling a bit, but when asked, you know, when have you been on a high performing team and what was happening there? Let's learn from what you already know. We generated this great list of strategies and, or I guess I would more call them principles and philosophies that, insights that emerge from those experiences. It's an interesting exercise with your senior leadership team to just say, you know what, you know, we're doing well in some areas, we're struggling in some other places. What do we already know as individuals about high performing teams? Let's generate that list of our own, and then let's figure out what parts of that list we might want to adopt. So another question I'd like to give you is, how do we show up for each other? This commitment to developing trust, to really being there with each other, for each other, and to not, I'm sorry to use so many cliches, but to not throw each other under the bus, if you will, when we don't agree with a decision or an outcome from a meeting. This is one of the disciplines of being a team. I think we might have a comment. Is that true, Izzy?
Yes, we had a question if the recording and the slides will be available, and they will. You'll receive tomorrow an email with the recording of the presentation and a PDF of our slide deck.
Thank you. So our last strategy is, I guess I'm surprised to find how passionate I am on this topic actually, but the use of meeting disciplines for accountability, alignment, and support. You know, the meeting disciplines, I just love this idea of discipline. And the discipline doesn't have to be harsh discipline. It just means using structures well. When a group, particularly a group grappling with controversial or difficult issues, a group that's pressed for time, a group that's trying to get the most out of their meetings, but everybody's distracted, you know, how do we come together and really use the 60 minutes or the 90 minutes that we have together? And so here are some things that have emerged from our work and that we see lots of places, and that we see is actually easy to say, harder to do. But how are agendas created? If you find yourself being disconnected from what's on the agenda, feeling like it may not be relevant for you, or that you're not sure how to participate in the discussion, that probably means there's an opportunity to collaborate on the agenda more, to get involved in how it's set, and to make sure that you're asking the question when there's an agenda item, what would be a valuable contribution from me about this topic? I'm not sure how I can contribute, but what would you like from me today? You know, don't be afraid to make sure that the agenda items are relevant, that they're topical, and that you understand what's needed from you. The next one is to set an intention for participation. This is quite personal. This has to do with when I walk into the room and sit down at the table, what is my intention about how I show up and participate? Maybe your intention is to be a good listener, for example. Maybe your intention is to, I had one client who went into meetings and she was so critical and frustrated with the meetings. So we set the intention that she would be a great helper of a good meeting. She would use every opportunity she could find to improve the quality of the conversation or the focus of the meeting. And she was startled to realize that she had been a consumer of meetings, going in, sampling them, and then critiquing them, without really realizing that by setting an intention to be helpful, she could actually shift the dynamic of the meeting. So what is your intention for participation? The next one is to start and end on time. And of course, I'm going very fast to make sure I do that for you today. But starting and ending on time is a covenant you have with people that they can rely upon the group and the meeting to be what it says it will be. It also means paying attention to the amount of time you're giving to topics and really thinking through, if all I have is 20 minutes, how do I get where we need to go in 20 minutes? Smart, experienced executives will really think through how they frame issues, what questions they put on the table, and how they bring the focus of the group to exactly the issues they need input on. So putting more time in up front so that starting and ending on time is possible. Celebrate your wins. Like, where's the progress? We're so oriented toward what's not working. What is working? What does celebrate actually mean? And I've been thinking that this is something I want to think more about is when something good happens, apart from ordering donuts or something, what do we do to acknowledge that something good has happened? And how do we clap each other on the back? How do we thank each other? How do we appreciate each other's teams and staffs for the work that they've done? And I think the question is how, because celebration could look different depending on your organization. And lastly, summarize decisions by when, who, next steps, and in writing. And again, my colleague Alexander Kaye suggests, and I concur, using a decision log so that each meeting there's a record of what was decided and what's going to happen. And then return to that decision log before the next meeting to say, let's hear some progress reports on what we agreed to. Some tips that make a difference. This is my favorite, no interrupting. Where there's interrupting, there's anxiety and frustration. That simple rule changes relationships and makes them more respectful. Set aside technologies that are unrelated to the meeting. I have noticed many people texting during meetings, and I've even learned that some people are texting other people at the meeting to make comments about the meeting itself. So I think that when we are fully present to the task at hand, and when the agendas are good and important, and when we're bringing that discipline to the conversation, even the most busy and urgent leader will be able to bring the focus needed. So set those technologies aside. Do the pre-work, come prepared. Listen well. This is the most underrated leadership skill and the most critical. Commit to being a listener and to asking good questions. Be all in once a decision is made. Don't second guess or talk behind the back of the team. You are the team. Use structure to frame issues and facilitate debate. If you know it's going to be a tough conversation, really work out how are we going to accomplish this conversation and bring a facilitative approach. Take real breaks. All the research shows us that human beings lose productivity and performance after 75 to 90 minutes of focusing on any one thing. So if you have a 3-hour meeting, don't skip the break. When I'm facilitating, my leader client will often say, let's skip the break. We have so much to do. And I really press not to do that, because you'll do better thinking and be far more productive and efficient if you take your breaks. Try meeting in the morning, not the afternoon. Again, the research shows that we are grumpy in the afternoon and sleepy. So if you want a better meeting, you might even just try shifting the time of day. We've been using mindfulness practices to center, focus, and refresh executive teams. Much to my surprise, even the most hardcore leadership groups welcome and appreciate the chance to center, to pause, to take some breath. A little bit nervous when we first started to do this, that this might be perceived as kind of out there, but what we've realized is that mindfulness practices are the antidote to the stress that we all experience. And then lastly, provide refreshments. People need to eat a little burst of sugar, whether it's fruit or something else, nuts, can really just help people have the stamina for the important meetings we have. These are really tactical things, but hopefully they're helpful to you. The strategies we've reviewed today are these 5 sets of ideas. There's so much here, and this is a big topic, but we just want to hearten you and encourage you not to accept the status quo, but actually to invite your senior leadership teams to take a more engaged approach and to really become cohesive teams. I know we're tight on time here, but is there any other comment or question that anyone has? We'll take a question or two before we close.
Yeah, so we had one that arrived earlier. Someone asked, Kate, what are your thoughts on addressing competition between senior team members and the senior leader?
Hmm. You know, that's a really great question. And that's often one that we address through team coaching. And we also address through looking at leadership styles. First, we have to ask ourselves, what is the reason for the competition? Is there a sense that your relationship to the senior most leader is crucial to your ability to succeed? You know, how has that senior leader created the dynamic of competition? It's also really important to have frank conversations about, you know, what are the motivations of each leader? What are they trying to do? Very often we perceive competitiveness when really there's a sense of urgency and even anxiety around something that I need in order to be successful in my job. I think very often when we start to really work on two things, what are the values motivating each leader? And the other thing, what are the styles, behavioral styles of each leader? We start to see that what looks like competition often is coming from a different place. So I'm giving sort of a broad answer here, but what I would say is, what does that senior most leader do to create the conditions that could allow a competitive environment? That would be one place to look, and to support that senior most leader with coaching or with feedback about that. And then the next would be to really look at, what is it we're competing about? Is it special status? Is it resources? And how can we better understand the motivations behind each of those leaders? So there's no way to solve it except to dig into it and trust that everybody wants to get up and have a good day and a great result. Most people, whenever I say that, people say, that's not true that everyone wants to, but I think for the most part, we want to be successful.
Sure. So we have one more question here, and this person says, it seems like many of the behavior changes needed by senior leadership team members really require interpersonal change and shifts in perspective, belief, and even values. And helping with this is often uphill sledding with highly successful individuals. So not quite a question, but a great comment.
A great observation, and that's right. In other webinars we've done, we've really talked about that leadership is an inner game, i.e. the reflective internal work of developing yourself so that you can be effective in a wide range of situations with a wide range of people plus stress, right? So leadership is an inner game, but it's a public act. We see each other leading. We're affected by each other's behaviors, attitudes, communications, and so on. So we have a responsibility to increase our self-awareness and to do that individually and as a team.
Great. And here's one last question for us to answer. This person asks, how can non-senior members support positive organizational culture if the SLT creates all these issues and challenges at the trickle down? That
sounds like a good next webinar topic. But what I would say about that one is, my mind goes to family systems theory, right? We want to believe that we have to reform the whole family in order to get the positive change we want in the family, when actually the research really shows us that one person making a positive change can actually change the dynamic of the entire group. So I would say that sometimes a dysfunctional senior leadership team is the excuse people use for their own dysfunction, and sometimes it's really truly a barrier and an obstacle to organizational success. What I see happening in a lot of organizations is there'll be a healthy dynamic that develops at the level below the senior leadership team, and even the level below that, where people are collegial, collaborative, solving problems across the system. And as a senior leadership team engages with their own challenges, they'll find that there's actually a real readiness on the part of their direct reports to support something better and different. I think if you're reporting to someone who's a real contributor to a dysfunctional factor, then the question I would ask if I were your coach is, remembering that you can only control one person, and that's you. What is it that you want to do to learn and grow in this situation? What courage do you need to find? And how can you find both the courage and the resilience and the creativity to take the learning from the situation, and that might involve some tough conversations.
Great, thanks, Kate.
Well, thank you all for joining us today. It's always fun to do this, and we'll be back again with another one in June. We'll be looking at some proven strategies for engaging and retaining a diverse workforce. We hope to have a special guest, and we're going to be talking about what does it take to have a culture that people want to work in, no matter their background, no matter their experience, no matter their identity, and what are some things that we know that we can share with you that might help you in that arena?
All right, well, we will send you all an email with a recording of the webinar and a PDF of the slides you just saw. And thank you all so much for joining us. We hope you have a wonderful day.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us.